Shocking. Bloc leader confronts Mark Carney. What are you hiding? Asset questions explode. In the days leading up to Canada's federal election on April 28, 2025, the political discourse has been rife with accusations, debates, and moments that could shape the future of the nation. One of the most explosive moments occurred during the final televised election debate when Yves-François Blanchet, leader of the Bloc Québécois, confronted Prime Minister Mark Carney on his financial dealings, particularly focusing on his time at the helm of Brookfield Asset Management. The confrontation sparked a firestorm of discussion as Blanchet raised critical questions about the ethical and financial practices surrounding Carney's leadership and, more importantly, about the transparency, or lack thereof, in his wealth and investments. Blanchet didn't hold back in his questioning, highlighting the fact that during Carney's tenure as leader of Brookfield, the company had registered numerous business entities in the Grand Cayman Islands, an offshore tax haven. This raised a significant red flag for critics, with some pointing to the location's reputation as a place notorious for facilitating tax avoidance strategies. The Cayman Islands, which former U.S. President Barack Obama famously described as the largest tax scam in the world, became the focal point of the debate. Critics have long argued that the use of such jurisdictions for financial transactions undermines the principles of fairness and accountability, particularly when it comes to public officials and their financial transparency. The optics were particularly troubling for Carney as Blanchet continued to press on the issue. Not only was the offshore investment structure under scrutiny, but Blanchet also highlighted the apparent contradiction between Brookfield's environmental claims and its financial practices. Carney, who has long positioned himself as a champion of green energy and sustainable development, was now being called out for Brookfield's significant investments in the fossil fuel sector. According to Blanchet, nearly 50% of Brookfield's portfolio was invested in fossil fuels, which directly undermine the company's purported focus on renewable energy. The reality of these investments raised concerns about the sincerity of Brookfield's environmental initiatives and whether Carney's vision of a greener future was more about corporate lip service than actual change. Carney attempted to defend his record, presenting Brookfield as a global success story. He emphasized the company's role as one of the world's largest infrastructure investors, which included substantial investments in renewable energy projects. According to Carney, Brookfield had been a leader in the development of green infrastructure, and the benefits of its investments could be seen in the pensions of Canadian workers and retirees. Carney also sought to deflect accusations of impropriety by asserting that he had always adhered to corporate governance standards during his time at Brookfield. He insisted that he had followed all necessary regulations and that his departure from the company had been in full compliance with the rules governing such transitions. However, despite Carney's defense, the question of transparency remained a major sticking point. As the debate continued, Carney was pressed to commit to revealing the full extent of his financial assets before the election. This call for greater transparency echoed the actions of other political leaders in Canada, including New Democratic Party, NDP, leader Jagmeet Singh, and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, both of whom had already made their financial holdings public. Blanchet's question was pointed. Why was Carney hesitating to follow the example set by his rivals? What was he hiding? The exchange not only highlighted the ethical concerns surrounding Carney's financial dealings, but also underscored broader issues of transparency in Canadian politics. As the election campaign intensifies, the question of financial transparency has become one of the most significant talking points. The electorate, more than ever, is demanding that political leaders be open about their financial affairs, particularly when they are seeking to lead the country. The ability of politicians to openly disclose their wealth and the potential conflicts of interest associated with it has become a key metric of their credibility. This moment in the debate is just one example of the growing focus on ethical leadership, particularly when it comes to issues of environmental responsibility and corporate governance. For many Canadians, Carney's history at Brookfield and his apparent connections to offshore financial hubs raises serious questions about whether his actions align with the values he has championed on the national stage. While Carney's defenders argue that his contributions to Canadian pensions and investments in renewable energy should be recognized, his critics argue that the potential conflicts of interest and lack of transparency undermine his claims to moral authority. The issue of fossil fuel investments remains particularly contentious. Canada has made significant strides in committing to reducing carbon emissions and promoting green energy. The federal government, under Carney's leadership, has positioned itself as a global leader in environmental policy. However, many are questioning whether Carney's financial backing of fossil fuel projects contradicts the very goals his government purports to support. Critics argue that the fossil fuel sector remains deeply entrenched in Carney's financial portfolio, undermining the credibility of his environmental policies. The hypocrisy of supporting renewable energy on one hand, while continuing to profit from the fossil fuel industry on the other, is a line of attack that opponents will continue to hammer as the election approaches. For Carney, the stakes couldn't be higher. The election is not just a battle for political power, it's a referendum on his leadership and his vision for Canada's future. As Canadians prepare to head to the polls, they will be asked to decide whether Carney's financial dealings and his record at Brookfield represent a leadership style they can trust. The question on everyone's mind is whether Carney's actions in the private sector align with the public values he espouses, and whether the electorate is willing to overlook potential conflicts of interest in favor of his political platform. As the election looms, the controversy over Carney's financial transparency is far from over. With leaders like Blanchet continuing to press the issue, and opposition parties eager to capitalize on any weakness, the pressure is mounting on Carney to reveal his assets and clarify his financial position. Will he bow to public demand for transparency, or will he continue to deflect and maintain a tight grip on his private wealth? This is a question that will no doubt dominate the final days of the campaign. In the broader context, the conversation around transparency is resonating beyond just Carney's personal finances. As the Canadian public increasingly demands accountability, political leaders across the spectrum are being held to higher standards. The scrutiny of financial dealings, offshore investments, and environmental hypocrisy has reached a tipping point, and the pressure to be open and honest has never been greater. For Mark Carney, this may be the defining issue of the election, whether he can convince Canadians that his vision for the country is more than just a carefully curated public image. The debate over Carney's assets also highlights a larger narrative about the role of money and influence in politics. In an era where public trust in political leaders is at an all-time low, the question of who benefits from these financial deals and who is left out has never been more relevant. For many Canadians, the idea of politicians enriching themselves while promising change is a deeply troubling thought. As such, Carney's response to the ongoing calls for transparency may determine not only the outcome of this election but also the future of Canadian politics. The final question that remains is whether the electorate will hold Carney accountable for his financial dealings or whether his political platform will be enough to carry him across the finish line. As the election approaches, one thing is clear: the issue of financial transparency will be a defining factor in how Canadians choose their next leader.